hard line, but these presenters are not your policymakers. To ask them questions or to come after them in some way, that's not going to make a difference. What's going to make a difference is to talk to the city council members, all right? They're your policy decision makers, and that's who you want to address your comments to. That's who you want to really talk to. So Jeremy, come on, let's talk about development alternatives.
Thank you, Mayor. Good evening. Thank you guys. Thanks everybody for coming. My name is Jeremy McAllister. I'm the project manager for the airport master plan. In addition to that, I'm also the office manager for the Heber City office of TO engineers. I wanted to talk a little bit about the airport alternatives before I get to the actual alternatives that we've looked at, continuing to look at. I do want to touch on the critical considerations that have guided all of the decisions and the different machinations that we've gone through with these alternatives. The first critical consideration is that the airport must meet all C2 safety standards to be considered compliant and to continue to be eligible for federal funding. Now, it's important to note that the C2 safety standards do not increase the airport's capacity, but compliance does increase the ability of the airport to safely accommodate the existing and forecasted traffic. The second critical consideration that went into all of the decisions that we've made up to this point is the strong community sentiment to limit the geographic size and the capacity of the airport. I apologize for the feedback. Do I need to be a little far away? Okay. Sorry about that. To limit the geographic size and capacity of the airport, and that has been central to all of our preliminary analyses. Options being considered limit any future land acquisition or easements necessary for those C2 standards, and they oppose any runway lengthening. Further preference was given to move the flight path farther away from the downtown area in the high school, and that was given strong consideration in all of the different alternatives that we are considering. The third constraint or critical consideration is that the airport alternatives must be viable with the future bypass considerations, even though those bypass alternatives are still to be determined or yet to be determined. The airport boundaries along the US 189 right-of-way for this study are assumed to stay the same. I'll just say that we've met with UDOT many times, and as previous speakers alluded to, they've told us very clearly that the boundary along US 189 is, we cannot assume that will be abandoned at any point. So keeping those critical considerations in mind in all of the decision-making process, I want to go through some of those alternatives. But first, I want to kind of show you the alternatives process. I just want to prep you. It's a flow chart, and we've tried to simplify it for the analysis process. And the point of this slide is not to go through all of the steps of the analysis process. I guess what I want to highlight is that it's a very iterative process where we wash through various alternatives, and go through great lengths to make sure that all the input and stakeholders are accounted for. I would just say that currently we're in this wheel portion of the alternatives analysis process where we continue to mull over these options. The other thing that I would mention on this is that the goal of this process is that we will come out of it with a recommended alternative, present that to the council, and the council will pick or choose a recommended alternative from the analysis process.
When is the timeline of that?
So the timeline, like I can't nail down the timeline to a specific date. But
generally,
because we want to take input, we've actually been taking input through the various meetings, and we'll continue to do that. For this alternatives process, I will say there's two things. One that extends the timeline, and that is we're looking at a C2 upgrade. And so impacts to the runway and taxiway, that's very complicated. That tends to extend the timeline. On the other side, we're very constrained, and I'll talk about constraints in a minute. So our options are very limited, and that tends to truncate. So when I get into the alternatives here in a minute, you'll see that those constraints have really limited our alternatives. So, that timeline could be expedited for that. We've stated as a goal to try and get through the alternatives process and into the next phase of the master plan by, early next spring, late winter. Does that answer your question, Tracy?
Early next spring 2023?
Or late winter 2022.
Okay.
Okay. So I want to move into actual alternatives that we've evaluated for just a minute and talk about a few preliminary alternatives. The first one that we've looked at, and let me, back up and say we've looked at a lot of different alternatives, but we wanted to highlight some of the alternatives that I would say we chewed on longer than others. This alternative here, we looked at a shift of the runway to the north and west of the existing alignment. Some of the benefits of that is that it would keep in place all of the airport improvements that currently exist, including the amount of usable ramp space, and it wouldn't displace any of our airport tenants. The fatal flaw with this alternative, going back to those critical considerations, is twofold, really. First and foremost, it's incompatible with that US 189 boundary. In our discussions with UDOT, as we were evaluating these alternatives, it became clear that any assumption of moving beyond that US 189 boundary we can't do that. The second, I would say, critical or fatal flaw to this preliminary alternative is this is not in line with community values. This would be, it would increase the geographic footprint, certainly of the airport, while it would be in full demand for the capacity of the airport. Frankly, there's no community or council support. And so for those two reasons, we've determined and presented our findings to the FAA, this is not a viable option. Another alternative that we looked at was, Dave alluded to the runway length earlier. Again, that's not a standard, but a recommendation, is what would a alternative that meets all of the demand, including the runway length, look like. So we did look at all of the conditions, including dry and wet. For our airport, we actually see an uptick in traffic during the wet months because of the tourism industry that we have. Excuse me. And based off the existing and forecasted traffic, it ends up extending the recommended runway length considerably, like about 1,700 more feet than what it currently is. This, again, does not meet those critical considerations. Primarily, that is the impacts to the land and the impacts to the community are too significant. There's a total lack of support, both in the community and the council. We've presented those findings to the FAA, and they have agreed that this is not a viable option for the community. Thank you. A third alternative I wanted to talk about, kind of the flip side of extending the runway, is looking at an alternative where we have a reduced runway length. One of the grant assurances, which we talked about grant assurances in a previous meeting, and we do have those on the website, the Heber Valley Flight Path website, but the airport cannot reduce or constrain the users of the airfield. We did an analysis of the traffic based on the existing runway length, and those planes are already coming in with limited cargo, and they're limited in their fuel and the weight that they're taking off. And so further constraining the users of the airport is not allowed by the FAA, and they would not support this alternative. Therefore, it has been deemed to not be viable. The last preliminary alternative I want to hit on, and we talked about this a little bit already, was could we look at a green site or an airport relocation? A couple of the primary fatal flaws. First off, there's not a site within Heber Valley for an airport relocation that's readily apparent. In addition to that, we are able to present an alternative that does meet all of the design constraints on the existing site with some modification. So for those reasons, the FAA will not support an airport relocation. Talking about the expense, looking at the land impacts that it would also be to the community. There's no support locally for, it's financially not feasible, and the local support for the land impacts is also not there. So for those two reasons, this one has been determined to not be viable as well. So I wanted to go through those to preface, what do we have left to consider, because the constraints really have narrowed the options to come up with solutions, which that I feel like is part of our job, is to try and come up with the best solution. So one of the things that we look at is, okay, can we create a C2 compliant airfield as close to what we currently are as possible? In other words, we looked at trying to create an alternative that we kept it on the same alignment. We did everything just as minimal change as possible, but still be compliant. And there were a lot of advantages to this. The amount of land impacted was significantly reduced from the previous alternatives that I showed. It also preserved a fair amount of available ramp space. Again, we have a high demand, and so ramp space is at a premium. It preserves a fair amount of that. So there are some advantages to this. A couple of fatal flaws that I'll just point out again. 189 still is a barrier. So, we're so constrained that even doing as close to nothing as possible by keeping it on the current alignment will not work with 189. Other things to consider is we have a runway protection zone in this blue area that's over an intersection at 189 and 1300 South that would require relocation of that intersection. That's a huge impact. Additionally, there are residences under that protection zone. There's a significant number of residences that would potentially need to be relocated. So it didn't meet the critical considerations with the 189 or the community impacts. Again, were great on this one. So that really, again, limited our options. It did provide some acreage for future development, but that's all within the existing airport boundary. It was important that we stay within that boundary. So that leads to the last alternative I want to present tonight, and that is a runway shift to the southwest from the existing alignment. And hopefully this depiction, you can follow along, but the existing runway is shown there, and then the shift to the southwest is in that darker gray. This is a fully compliant C2 alternative that shifts the runway about 140 feet south or away from 189 and about 680 feet away from downtown. Now, I will say that this option has the lowest amount of impact in terms of land affected of any of the alternatives considered. Additionally, I just want to make sure I'm checking the notes here. In addition to the minimal amount of land acquisition or land that needs to be controlled by easement, I would say another positive to this that wasn't necessarily a critical consideration, but that was given heavy consideration, is that it moves the flight path away from downtown or further away from downtown, which we take to be a positive. It also moves that safety area that I talked about on the northeast end out of the downtown area, and would allow, there would be no displacement of any residents on that end. It isn't a perfect solution. We recognize that. There is an increase, I would say. There's an increase on the southwest end of that runway protection zone, with some landowners that potentially will be impacted impacted. However, this does satisfy all three of those critical criteria of the critical considerations that I discussed earlier. So with that, those are the primary alternatives that we had to present tonight. Before I turn the time back over to Mayor Franco, I did want to just briefly go over kind of next steps in terms of the master plan, like what comes after alternatives. So if you'll bear with me, this will probably be the only slide I'll read to you. I know we all love that. But in terms of next steps, once we get through the alternatives process, like I mentioned before, we will present council with a recommended alternative based off all the stakeholder input. The council will consider all the stakeholder input and it will select a recommended alternative. That recommended alternative will be incorporated into a draft airport layout plan. Those are basically our plan sheets that show what the future airport would look like based off of that recommended alternative. From that, we will start to evaluate the environmental impacts of that recommended alternative. Additionally, we will then take a deep dive into the financial feasibility of that recommended alternative and would look at things including like phasing of how that would be implemented to be least impactful to the current tenants and also the most affordable to both the sponsor, in this case the city, as well as the FAA. Once we're through those steps, basically the environmental considerations and the financial feasibility, we'll compile a draft master plan. Again, we'll have another public meeting taking the input, and we'll provide a master plan in draft with the ALP to the council for their consideration and approval. Once a master plan is approved by the council, we submit that draft master plan to the FAA for their review and acceptance. After we get approval of a master plan by the council and acceptance of the master plan by the FAA, that really ends the master plan process. That master plan becomes final, and then the airport would go into an implementation phase that would be phased out over many years, presumably. So that's really the next steps. I'm going to turn the time back over to you, Mayor Franco. Yes, ma'am, you got it.
I just want all of you to see that. Okay, everyone, now let me just kind of summarize here. Thank you so much for your patience tonight. Remember that all of these consultants are experts and they can answer any question you have, and they say there are no dumb questions, and they will take your comments and they'll be writing them down, but you really should submit your own comments. The paper is back there, the papers, right? You can also email them to the city manager, the city airport manager, Travis Biggs, that you've seen tonight, and his information, Katie, is on the handouts, right? She's got the handouts back there. There's the public comment form. Where's the handouts that has Travis's information and the website information? It's on the public comment form. Okay, Katie, did you get these materials put onto the website yet? Okay, at 8:30, so tonight, half an hour, everything you've seen is going to be on the Heber Valley Flightpath.com website, okay? So you don't have to just write your public comment tonight. You've got 2 weeks, right, to submit it on the website or to Travis Biggs, and then you're all welcome again to come to the city council meeting, likely on October 18th. And I'll make sure we're ready for you and the microphone's ready, okay? Now, you might have questions about noise and curfew. This is not the meeting to ask questions about how noisy the airport is or can there be a curfew. We already have a voluntary curfew in place. It's voluntary. That's all the FAA allows. Noise considerations will happen further on in the next steps, as you just saw, once the city council accepts one of these alternatives that you've seen tonight. These alternatives will be presented to the city council along with your comments that we get in the next 2 weeks.
So in 2 weeks.
2 weeks.
But then your meeting's on the 18th. So
Yes.
it's too late with comments to have an open mic.
Well, it's going to be a public hearing. I'll make sure it's a
Isn't
public
that
hearing.
too late for your comments in front of everybody?
No, you can come and give your comments there
It won't
too.
mean anything because it's 2 weeks after.
As long as they haven't voted yet, your comments mean something.
Oh, it's
Okay?
just, this said baloney. This is bull baloney listening to you tonight.
I think you should ask the experts those very questions, and I think those are the comments you should ask, because I'm not going to be the expert on this, all right? But everyone, I would like our city council members to stand up one more time. Rachel Taylor's joined us, and there's Rachel. And then towards the back, we have Yvonne Barney. She's in the hazard sweater. And then Ryan Stack is 2 down from her, and Scott Phillips is here, right there. And I don't believe Mike Johnston is here, but they're your policy makers, everyone. They're the ones that are going to take the vote. All right, so you're welcome to go to these different stations that we have in the back, grab some cookies and